Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Oswald, Press Freedom Team Lead for the National Press Club and Journalism Institute. Welcome to this program, which is being produced in partnership with the Society of Professional Journalists. We thank you for making the time to be here. We'll be recording this program and the video will be on our website and in our newsletter next week. So if you missed something, don't worry, you'll have a chance to catch it a second time. We hope you'll have questions. Please share them anytime in the Q&A queue. We'll be monitoring them and responding in the last part of the program. I'd also like to note at the start that while we are going to be examining in detail the impacts of local government policies that require journalists to go through public information officers with their education reporting requests, we here at the National Press Club and the club's Journalism Institute want to make it clear that we recognize the important role that public affairs officials play in helping to inform the press, including often on deadline and at times of high stress. As a reporter myself covering national security for over a decade in Washington, I've personally come to appreciate how many public affairs officials do take a public servant's view of their work. With that in mind, it is our hope that PIOs and journalists can find ways to better work together so that we can all better serve the American people. It is with that spirit that we offer this panel discussion to you all. And now it is my honor to introduce our panel. Eva-Marie Ayala is the Education Lab editor for the Dallas Morning News, where she oversees coverage of how state and local policies impact students, what schools are doing to address inequities in classrooms, and how educators are addressing the great needs brought on by the pandemic. Frank LoMonte is a professor at the University of Florida and counsel at CNN. From 2017 until last month, he was the director of the Joseph L. Bruckner Center for Freedom of Information at the University of Florida. There, he led the center to become an incubator for ideas and initiatives that give the public timely and affordable access to the information necessary for informed, participatory citizenship. We are expecting to be joined by Randi Weingarten. She is the president of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers, AFL-CIO, which represents teachers, paraprofessionals, and school-related personnel, as well as higher education faculty and staff, nurses and other healthcare professionals, local, state, and federal government employees, and early childhood educators. Randi has held that position since 2008, and once Randi does join us, we'll just fit her right into the conversation. Lastly, I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator, Delece Smith-Barrow. Delece is the education editor at POLITICO. She previously worked at the Hessinger Report, U.S. News and World Report, and the Washington Post. She spent the 2016-2017 school year as a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan. Delece, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It looks like we have a really good crowd, so I'm excited to kick this off. And just to piggyback on some of what Rachel said, today we're really going to focus on barriers to getting information in education news and in other news. One thing that journalists face so often is not being able to get the information that they want or get access to someone who has the information that they need. And it's not that we need it personally, it's that news consumers need it. They're using our stories to make decisions about their lives, where to send their children to school, who to vote for. So this is a pretty serious issue when we're being unfairly blocked to get information that's important to news consumers. And some of that can look like slow or no response to a FOIA request. And like I said earlier, maybe there's a principal, an administrator that is central to your story who you need to reach, and you're being told by the school district that person can't speak with you. Or maybe you have the phone interview and there's so many people on the call, you can't even tell which one is the one you need to hear from. Sometimes the blocking is more subtle, sometimes it's more direct. So I really want to make sure we touch on these points today and give you all some tools for what you can do if you're ever in this situation. So my first question, and I think Ava, Frank, both of you can probably tackle this. What do you do when you're told either by the school or the district that, for example, a teacher that you need to speak with cannot speak to you? How do you handle that? Because this person is actually an adult, but you're hearing from their employer that they cannot speak with you. Ava, let's start with you.
Hey, thanks everyone for being here. there's going to be multiple ways to address this. And again, it depends on the situation and, what exactly is the information you're trying to get. For example, there was a local agency that was involved in some kind of controversy, and there was a particular employee who was being called out in some court documents as being a hindrance to the process. And so we reached out directly to that person, left messages, hey, you're named in this, we want to give you a chance to respond. And the PR person got back to us and was really upset, was, saying that we're being nefarious and going around them. And, that is our job. If we're going to name somebody and put their name in the paper and say, like, there's this allegation against them, we have a duty to do as much as possible and go above and beyond to reach out to that person and make sure we're giving them a fair opportunity to comment and give their side of the story. It is up to them whether or not to comment or not. Often these policies are the school district's policies themselves. They're not our policy, right? Our policy is to be as fair as possible. If it is a situation where it's about a certain topic, like a topic on reading or a topic about counselors in the school, then, we try to find other workarounds to where, one, if it's a particular individual, we'll try and reach that individual anyway, but also, some of those associations, statewide associations, national associations, I think, depending on what your news outlet is and who your audience and community you're serving, sometimes it's better to go with that statewide organization who has the particular knowledge and history of what's happening in your community so that they can better connect the dots for your readers and your families. So, I mean, there's several different tricks to going around it, but those are some of my go-tos.
I'll just go ahead and add to that you should know from a starting point as a journalist that a public school or a public college or university is a government agency. And as a government agency, they are bound to adhere to First Amendment standards. The Supreme Court has said over and over again that public employees do not check their First Amendment rights at the door when they sign on to take a government job. And that applies to teachers or principals or coaches or anybody at a public school. And so these pervasive policies, which we see at all levels of government, including education, that restrict employees from being able to talk without permission, they're all against the law. And I realize that this is a mind-blowing thing for people because these policies are everywhere. But the fact that they are everywhere does not mean that they are legal. It just means that they are common. It's like saying everybody is driving 85 miles an hour past me on the interstate. That doesn't mean it's legal. It just means it's common. And all government agencies that have policies that say everybody here is forbidden from speaking without permission are skating on very thin First Amendment ice, and they're asking to be sued. And we at the Breckner Center have done some research on this. I'll drop a link to the paper in the chat, but every single time a public employee has sued a government agency over the legality of one of these policies, these gatekeeping policies, that public employee has won and the agency has lost. And this is going back 50 years. So the courts have unanimously spoken to this. So I think the very first thing to know is that an agency really can't interfere with your ability to speak candidly with an employee if the employee is willing to speak to you. And then write about the policy. I get a copy of that policy, write about it, publicize it, question it, challenge it. Oftentimes you actually find out that the policy either doesn't exist at all, or it's better than you're being told it is. I ran into this recently. We just did a research paper about police departments, and both the Chicago Police Department and the Philadelphia Police Department have very good policies on paper that are very pro-speech and very pro-employee, but nobody at those police departments knows that that's the rule, and they're all under the impression that they need permission before they can speak, so they're all behaving as if they're gay. So sometimes just publicizing the fact that, no, you have a very good policy here, and it actually gives you a lot of rights to speak publicly, sometimes publicizing that could be a really helpful role for journalists.
I just want to pause and make sure everyone says hello to Randi Weingarten, president of one of the largest teacher union, American Federation of Teachers. Randi, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you're very busy, so we
Thank you, and I'm so sorry I was delayed. We had an issue around the Minneapolis strike, so I had to deal with it. So my apologies.
No worries. And just to kind of catch you up, so we're talking about, as journalists, for example, sometimes there might be a teacher or administrator that we wish to speak with, and maybe the school or the district has said, no, you may not speak with this person. Can a union ever help in this situation? Do you feel like that's an option for the journalist to go to that teachers union and say, hey, we've heard this issue has come up. Would it be possible for you to help us get in touch with this person to make sure we can get their side?
The answer is yes, 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 yes. And in fact, look, journalists, I want to just take it back a step, which is you have an obligation to cover what's going on. I believe that we as unions have an obligation to treat you with that respect and dignity. Even if we hate what you write later on, we have that obligation, because that transparency and that fight against misinformation and that fight against propaganda and that fight against that kind of undermining of voice and democracy, this is a bigger value for all of us. It's a huge value, and it's really important to deal with the transparency and the truth on one hand, and the fight against misinformation and propaganda on the other. And so, I think we have that obligation regardless, as workers, as colleagues, as an understanding of what journalism is supposed to be, and how you need that ability to do your job. So when I was a local president in New York City, we always had great relationships with the journalists who covered the school system, obviously trying to make sure that our point of view was there, but the trust had to be earned. And so that issue of earning that trust is really important. Now, given everything that's going on in terms of misinformation, polarization, propaganda, censorship, algorithms, that all of this stuff, I think that obligation is even more so. And what happened in Philadelphia, look, you wouldn't say that Philadelphia was the same situation as Putin, obviously. Putin is a murderer. Putin is creating genocide. But the roots of it are very dangerous. The roots of basically saying, we're going to stop people from giving real, accurate, truthful information about conditions of a public good and a public. So I'm not going to it from the legal side. I'm going to it from the policy side. Public education is a public good. The public is entitled to know what's going on. Teachers should be able to say what's going on. There should not be this censorship about this. And so, of course, the union should be a vehicle to help that. And the union should be that vehicle, because the union also can help protect people who are, trying to speak honestly and speak truthfully. Just like what we've tried to do in terms of the teaching of honest history, that I've said publicly that we will support and protect anyone who teaches honest history, and to not feel chilled or intimidated or bullied out of doing that. So it's a long way of saying yes, but for the reasons why.
I would say, related to that and to what Buffy was asking in the chat, is there a difference between an employee speaking out on their own situations and experience versus as an institution? And I think on journalists, it's also important for us to provide that context, right? And not misrepresent what the capacity this person is speaking in. And for example, we're all covering a lot of fights about books and the books that are under attack in different schools. And so we wanted to hear from librarians on what that meant in their day-to-day operations, how they were navigating that. And so we were able to talk to someone who's the president of the state school library association, who also works in a local school district, and framing that she was talking on behalf you know, in her capacity as president of this organization, which gave her, you know, this expertise, you know, just adding that line, you know, kind of helps put into context, like she's not speaking on behalf of the school district, she's speaking on behalf of librarians, right?
I think it's important to kind of make that point to sources who are sometimes hesitant to speak, building off of what Ava and Randy mentioned. It's about getting the truth out, and you don't want someone else to tell your truth. You know, you want to have a say in what's being told about you. So, and I think oftentimes there's this instinct to retreat from the media, to assume that whatever is going to come out is going to be bad or disparaging. And I think you want to focus on, is it true? And at the same way that you're worried about, well, will the media make me look bad? This could also be about, you know, protecting your job. What if we find out something that impacts your ability to educate, to help students? Would you not want the media to reveal that information? So thinking broadly about how the press does help with transparency and democracy. And kind of switching gears, still in the classroom, but I want to talk about interviewing students. Now, when it's an adult, it can be a little clearer because the person is over 18, but I'm thinking of minors. You know, maybe something has come up with a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old at a high school. And it can be confusing to understand, is it legal for me to interview this person without a parent present? You know, like, or does the legality change based on whether I'm interviewing them on school grounds versus across the street from school, you know, versus at a park, and kind of getting a better understanding of where the lines are. So Frank, you're our in-house lawyer for the hour. Can you kind of walk us through what we all should know, especially if a school says, hey, you cannot interview this person, they're a minor, you know, just fall back?
Yeah, so there's a distinction between what the law is and what school policies might be. And many people end up agreeing to abide by a particular school policy as a condition to being admitted to the building. And of course, once you agree to abide by the policy, a deal's a deal, and ethically you should abide by the policy. There's only one state that I'm aware of, that's California, that actually has a law in the books that says public schools have to afford journalists reasonable access to get into the building. But if you're not fortunate enough to be in that state, then in the other 49 states, you're sort of admitted to the building by the grace of the proprietors of the building, right? And at that point, they get to set the ground rules. Now, having said that, there's not a children's invisibility law in America. It is not a thing. And so kids absolutely have the right. And I would argue that we as journalists have the responsibility to make sure that they're not invisible, that they're actually seen, heard, respected, and honored for the complex human beings that they are, and not pieces of furniture owned by their parents. And so we should be doing everything we can to try to include them in the coverage. Now, so my strategic advice would be, by all means, include kids in your coverage, but as much as you can, try to build those contacts and those relationships after hours so that you can meet the kid at the Starbucks, meet the kid at the bubble tea shop, and talk to them there, as opposed to trying to get into the school building and mic them up when there might be. Many schools have adopted rules that kind of shackle their hands, where they promise parents, look, we guarantee you that you will never see your kid in the media without your written permission. And so they've kind of tied their own hands and made, in my view, inadvisable promises of confidentiality beyond what they would be legally required to make. But once they've made those, they're sort of stuck too. So I think the strategic answer is, do look for opportunities to work kids into your coverage. They have really important perspectives that deserve to be heard in education, but to the extent that that can be after hours, all the safer for everybody.
No, I think that's a good distinction between the state's policy and what's happening on the school. But Ava, I was actually going to ask you to chime in for what have you done in those situations?
You know, you have to approach this with humanity, right? You can't just have a one size fits all approach to, you know, to anything, but particularly to interviewing kids, right? If you're talking to children who are, you know, I've interviewed children who have left school to protest immigration policies because their parents are here and not documented, right? Well, how do you identify those students, right? You know, you don't want to put them in a situation where they are putting their families and themselves at risk, but you know, it is a story of the day. It is something major that's happening, right? And so you find ways to identify those students while, you know, not overstepping boundaries and putting the families at risk. You know, there's been situations where even a parent has given permission to use their children's name. You know, we've written a lot about transgender students, about situations, and you know, how do you approach those? The parents like, you know, we're proud of our child. We, you know, we have nothing to hide. We want to normalize this. So, you know, are they in a situation where, you know, you walk through with them and say, okay, like this is going to be online. This is going to be, you know, there's going to be a photo, like art, like making sure that they are aware of the repercussions and then respecting the family's decision, right? It's not, again, it's not an easy answer, but it's approaching it with humanity, having the law on your side, absolutely. And know, you know, there are things that happen when you absolutely, you know, need to identify who's speaking. You know, we had a school shooting here last year that, you know, made national news, and, you know, interviewed students who were there, families who were there, you know, identifying like, you know, these are real sources and real people that had these experiences. So, you know, trying to balance the immediacy and the needs of the day with humanity.
If I could add two things. First, definitely as a, you know, good practice and good policy, I would be sort of age specific in how I approach these interviews, so that it's not a one size fits all policy. The kind of thing that would be perfectly fine for a 16-year-old to consent to saying might not be fine if it was an 11-year-old. Right. And so as a child gets older, the law kind of recognizes a greater capacity to consent to things. And so certainly with either a very young child or a child that was a special ed child, a child that you sort of felt maybe for whatever reason didn't have the full cognitive ability to make an intelligent consensual decision like that, maybe you do, as a matter of good policy and practice, move the parents in, particularly if they're about to disclose something like Eva was saying that was really sensitive about their own health or their own education or any sensitive family matter. I mean, at some point, if they're disclosing sensitive things about the family, then that becomes really the family's privacy interest more than the child's. And you have to think about, does this implicate the mom or the dad as well? Other thing, I just see a question in the chat that's really interesting from Mr. McKibben about the rights of school board members. And so there's two interesting things that work there. Thing number one, the US Supreme Court actually has a case right now that is right to be decided any day called the Wilson case that is about this exact thing, about what are the First Amendment rights of people who have elected office as opposed to being hired employees. This happens to be a guy who's a college trustee in Texas, but it will influence the First Amendment rights of all elected officials. So keep an eye on that. But even more practically to the point, and we hear this all the time where people will get a message from a public relations office and they'll say, you are required, and that's often the language used, you're required to go through me. And, you know, I don't want to be a jerk about this, but my response would be, or else what? You know, or else what? In what way do you have authority to direct who I email or don't email? What would be the consequences exactly? Can you spell those out to me? Even better, point me to a policy in writing that says that there will be punitive consequences brought down on journalists who email school board members without the consent of the public relations office. I will guarantee you that that policy does not exist. And if it does exist, call a lawyer.
Right. And I have, like, again, in Texas, we have a school board association that teaches the team of 8 and how, you know, you want to have these united school boards and that it's good practice to have one designated person, typically the school board president, to be the person who speaks on behalf of the board. Again, that is their practice. That is not our practice. You know, these school board members are elected by the public. They don't elect one person for the whole board. They individually elect the school board trustees to speak, and you reach out to them as needed. If they decline to comment, you put that in there. You know, again, it's all about transparency. One time I was covering years ago a superintendent scandal in a smaller district in the North Texas area. And I had called one of the trustees who had formerly been the school board president and a former city councilman. And I was like, come on, man, tell me what's going on. He's like, I want to tell you, it's like looking at a chicken fried steak and not being able to eat it because you know it's bad for you, but I want to eat it so bad. And I was like, calling me chicken fried steak, like, but they get it in their head that they're in these positions. I was like, you know, the board, the public didn't elect just the school board president. They elected individual people to represent their community, and that is who you're accountable for. And if you don't want to speak to them about the decisions you're making, then I'm going to put that in the paper.
And I want to, I was going to go back to Randi actually, based on a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Explanation about Philadelphia. Randi, for anyone who might be out of the loop, can you just walk us through what happened in Philadelphia in terms of
Sure.
educators being barred or trying to be barred from speaking with the press?
Sure. So I think what's happened is, and look, I also want to make a push for, this is one of the reasons why having local media is so important, and trying to figure out, you know, trying for us outside of media to fight for more local media, because that's also where you have trusted journalists who will, you know, who know the town or know the community, and there's you know, and the community will actually be more respectful of what a local media says than, you know, a tweet from out of town or, you know, some other kinds of things. So it's really, you know, so I'm just making a real plug for local media, if I may. So, but in terms of Philadelphia, so Heidi Presbola, this is what I think happened. Heidi Presbola from NBC highlighted over a period of time the crumbling infrastructure in Philadelphia schools, including the fans that were bought from a dollar store instead of actually fixing the ventilation systems. Now, Philadelphia has a long history, as does so many urban school systems, of underfunding their schools, and has a long history of crumbling infrastructure, lead in the pipes, in the water pipes, asbestos in the walls. And there has been, you know, pushes to try to clean it up and to try to fund our facilities. There's a big public-private partnership that's led by Senator Vincent Hughes that has tried to do that. The school system has always felt, you know, has always been on the defensive. First, the school system was under state control, but even after state control was lifted, it has a very much of a bunker mentality. So after this very big push and this embarrassment, this is my view, but the timing seems to work. After this embarrassment of these dollar fans that actually pushed air inward instead of outward, and was not going to actually help in terms of reopening schools, creating good ventilation systems, as we're trying to get kids back to school. And there was a one-day strike, and there was a lot of tumult on top of all of the COVID tumult. You started seeing the Board of Education, or the Chancellor Haidt, Superintendent Haidt, try to come up with this policy. And they did it in the guise of diversity and equity, but the policy was essentially a gag order, and that employees were no longer allowed to actually speak to the press without express permission from the district. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the Philadelphia situation. I'm sure Frank would agree with me that is, and you know, we're suing them and whatever, that is prior restraint. But the core of it is what, the reason that this is so wrong is for all the reasons that I said before. Forget about the legal reasons. The policy reasons of public education is a public trust. And if we don't make sure that the public actually sees what's going on in schools, good, bad, and other, then how is the public going to trust that the schools are taking care of our kids and the schools have the resources they need for teachers to teach and children to learn? And so that's part of the reason why on a public policy issue, this is so wrong, not just in terms of issue of gagging and not disclosing information or intimidating people. And there was a question in the chat, which I agree with, which is that most of the time, teachers feel very much alone regardless. There is, in some ways, a reason why teachers are the most densely organized people these days in America. They feel very, very, very alone in their classrooms. They feel very alone in terms of of what is thrown at them and what they have to try to handle. And so the intimidation, the fear that if you say something wrong, you're going to get harmed, you're going to get yelled at, you're going to get disciplined. All of that is intense for teachers. And so teachers many times will just close their doors and try to make sure nothing shows up in their, that everything outside of the classroom is outside, and they're just trying to do the best they can. And they do feel very intimidated about talking or about getting in trouble for revealing what's going on.
One thing I will say, when we were talking earlier about building trust, on deadline is not the time to build trust, right? You want to build those relationships as far ahead in advance as you can. And when we talk about this, fear of educators and other staff not wanting to talk to the media because they've been told, no, one thing that is good to try and have is conversations with PR folks on why they should cooperate. There is one particular district in our area that I covered for many years. And when I was new to the area, I didn't know anything. So I sent out an email to every single principal, basically like a questionnaire, like, hey, I'm introducing myself. I'm new to the area. Tell me about your school. Is there any traditions I should know about? I can't cover every carnival. I can't cover every, dress up day. But what are the things that are unique to your school? Unique programs, something in your community. I'm always looking for good stories. If you know anything that's not involved in school, like, here's my information, what's your cell, this and that. I emailed it to every single principal in the district. And within like 3 minutes, the PR person was blowing up my phone, like, why are you reaching out to them? If there's something, I'll tell you. Blah, blah, blah. I was like, well, again, that's not your policy. That's my policy. And as the years, I had 2 people respond to that survey out of 70 plus principals. And one of them was just like a fantastic story. I'll tell y'all later. But the years later, I was still having to negotiate access with this school district for another story. And they got a new superintendent. The superintendent wanted to talk, and they were like, well, I'm new to the area too. I just want to get your thoughts on, the district and what, you see as a media person. I was like, well, it's really easy to cover the bad stories here. It's very difficult to cover the good stories here. And he's like, well, that's not what you want to hear. And the woman who was above the person who was the PR person was about to have a heart attack. And I was like, if there's something bad going on, don't worry. People are going to tell us. We're going to find out. Someone's going to reach out. We'll know. Don't worry. But the most difficulty I have is telling when good things are happening. I reach out. I want to talk to the person involved. They don't want to talk. We can't make them talk. They don't want to talk. Like, I understand that. I understand the hesitancy, but no one's rarely told, here's the benefit of talking. You're the subject matter expert. Here's what's happening in your classroom that's going to illuminate the challenges that we're facing in the pandemic or whatever the case. rarely is that discussion happen to say, we want you to talk because this is good for the district, this is good for teachers, this is good for your class because. And, you know, when situations like, you know, sometimes you can win in those kind of fights to get access and sometimes not. But the other workaround I would say is like, don't just rely on the same school districts that you go to day in and day out. You know, build relationships with others. There is a smaller district in the Dallas area. You know, we were having a lot of trouble getting inside schools to really show like what the strain on staff was in the pandemic. And a smaller school district about an hour and a half outside of Dallas, Terrell, you know, we reached out to them and they're like, come on, like, we want to show you what we're dealing with. It's a small, you know, rural district that's spread out. The superintendent has to serve as a substitute teacher. You know, one of the teachers gets up in the morning, drives the bus, goes to class, teaches, ends the day, drives the bus again, and then does her work to grade papers. You know, the school nurse is trying to juggle all the things at once. I mean, it was a very intense look at what the pandemic was doing to schools. And, you know, this was a district where we don't typically cover. So having those kinds of, you know, access to people to show other districts, like, this is what happens when you let us in, when we can tell the story of what's happening. You know, these are the kinds of things that we're trying to do. We're not trying to be your cheerleader. We're not trying to knock you down. We're trying to give an honest and accurate portrait of what's happening in our communities and in our schools.
I know we're getting some questions in the chat, and we actually will pivot to a question and answer portion. But before we do that, I wanted to throw out one more topic for the panel. At the top of the hour, I mentioned FOIA requests. Sometimes as a journalist, you are going in circles, you are trying to follow up on the status of your request. You're not sure when or if you will get an answer to data that you are entitled to because it is public information of some sort, but you're just struggling to get this request fulfilled. I guess I'll start with Frank. What should you do when you as a journalist are facing barriers to getting a FOIA request response in a timely manner? Because that's another thing. Sometimes you'll get the response, you know, 2 years later, and it's like, well, the story has changed and this is no longer relevant.
Yeah. Oh, this is so my jam. Yeah. So the frustrations that I hear all day from journalists are in three different buckets, right? There is timeliness, there is cost, and there is exemptions. And on the timeliness and on the cost, the answer is really the same, which is, you know, just go into used car buying mode. Only a chump pays the sticker price, right? And so don't pay the sticker price, haggle, treat that first quote, it's gonna take 6 months and cost $4,000 as the starting point in the negotiation, and push back on it and know your state law, because often the state law entitles you to a faster response and a cheaper response, right? One of the things that we've seen government agencies do a lot is sort of gold plate the fees by saying, well, we're going to charge you $250 an hour for our law firm to look over the shoulder of the records custodian and go back in and redact out information. And there's every chance that under your state law that they can't charge you that $250, but just be a skeptical consumer of those invoices. On the exemptions, you know, you can't talk about that without the elephant in the room. FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which is the kind of #1 tool that schools and colleges always pull out of the quiver when they get hit with a FOIA request. And the thing to know there is that FERPA, despite what a lot of school authorities have gotten into their heads, is a very narrow law. It applies to almost nothing that any journalist would legitimately want to see. What the Supreme Court has said is that FERPA applies to that subset of student records that is centrally maintained in their permanent file, the thing that your principal always threatened you with. This is going on your permanent record. This is going on your permanent record. That's the subset of records that FERPA applies to. It doesn't even apply to something, says the Supreme Court, like a quiz paper that's distributed in a classroom. I think you and I, and a lot of us would probably think, well, that's an education record and FERPA applies to education records, but the Supreme Court has said, no, that's too ephemeral of a record. It's not centrally maintained in a permanent file with the student's name on it. And so that's the first thing to know, is that this is really a very narrow law, and in no way does it apply to every 3x5 index card that happens to have a student's name on it. And it certainly does not apply to data. And that's what we've seen throughout the pandemic, is these crazy over-compliant responses from schools and colleges saying, we can't tell you whether there's 3 cases or 300 cases in our school, because somehow the Sherlock Holmes of data will be able to re-engineer the names of the kids based on, and that's not a thing. It's just not a thing. No one who doesn't already know that it's Billy and Bobby and Johnny who have COVID is going to be able to engineer their names based on the numeral 3. And so you just got to push back against that. I would say, I would honestly ask, walk me through the steps exactly. Walk me through the steps where a person who doesn't already know Billy and Bobby and Johnny is going to add this data up and come up with Billy and Bobby and Johnny's names. And they won't be able to do it. The answer is you just can't. And so data, numbers, trends, all those things are fair game to ask for under a FERPA request, a FOIA request, and FERPA is no legal impediment.
Right. And I would say, one, if there is a Sherlock Holmes of data out there, please contact me. We're looking for a data editor. 2, make sure you know what your state's open records laws are as far as getting access to information. Routinely, when there's a situation where we want a personnel file or an investigative report, like a district does an internal report over some allegation that happened involving a teacher or an employee, and we request that information, I've seen more and more districts try and say, okay, like we'll release the information, but agree that we can withhold information that's evaluative in nature that would fall under personnel exemptions. And I always say, no, we're going to have to see that, because they try to say that the investigation itself is evaluative in nature, and that is not correct. And the Attorney General's office has said repeatedly over and over again that that document must be released. So if they're trying to tell you that an internal investigation must be withheld, make sure you know what your state open records laws are.
Anything that does it in any way differentiate when it's a FOIA request about a student versus an administrator, or do the rules still stay the same?
Well, so one thing that the courts have been very emphatic about is that FERPA is about records that, quote, directly pertain to a student. In other words, it is a record of the student. And so let's just take the hypothetical example of like a misconduct investigation like Eva is talking about an employee or an administrator. That's not a document that would go in that student's file. That's a document that would go in that administrator's personnel file, maybe. And so just by definition, it doesn't meet the threshold to be a FERPA record. And so by all means, I mean, there's ample case law out there saying that, something like a teacher or an administrator or coach who's accused of wrongdoing towards students, that's not a student record, even though students are peripherally or tangentially involved in it. In fact, very good rulings recently out of both the University of Kentucky and the University of North Carolina, just making clear how narrow FERPA is, and requesters have had pretty good luck in the courts challenging these overly broad applications.
So, I think you're going to, all of these kind of go into a few categories. So the moment that there's a category about misconduct, you're going to have the person who's representing the person who's accused, want to keep everything away from, until there's a adjudicatory hearing. You're going to have a bunch of people saying it's due process, there needs to be an investigation. So you're going to have, you'll have unions, or you'll have a parent, you'll have a lot of people actually pushing back on that for all the, somebody might say, oh, the wrong reasons outside, but for all the right reasons in terms of due process. So I would just, so that's going to end up becoming a category in the, when there is those kind of investigations. But there's also the conditional investigations. There's also a whole bunch of other things that don't get to X is accused of doing Y against Z. And if you end up the environmental issues have nothing to do with FOIA or FERPA. They're the environmental issues in a school, the lack of financing, the curriculum issues, I can think of any number of issues that have nothing to do with that. And so if one asks the question in a different way, there is no actual need to see a specific student record or a specific employee record. And I'm not, I'm putting these two issues aside because there's plenty of things in terms of covering schools that have nothing to do with FOIA or FERPA. It's just that the boards of education don't want to, go through what their proceedings are in terms of what they have actually really said or not. Take what just happened in terms of Douglas County, Colorado. There's this whole big brouhaha right now because a new board came in. They wanted to fire the current school superintendent. The new board didn't know how to do it. The superintendent is a good person he's not ideological. He just wasn't as right-wing as the new board. So the new board wanted to do that. Teachers and students end up supporting in rallies the superintendent. So then they decided they were going to go after, they were using somebody's FERPA foil to go after all the students and all the teachers who actually were in the rally supporting the superintendent. So you can see how this stuff ends up becoming weaponized one way or the other, as opposed to what journalists are trying to do, which is just to try to get to the truth.
I should say, in the context of FERPA too, if you're in that negotiating process with the school district or a university or a college, do be aware that in the 45 years that statute has been on the books, 0 institutions have been penalized as violators. $0 in fines have been assessed. And so FERPA is the nuclear option. It is for an educational institution that just wholly disregards student privacy as a matter of practice and practice and policy, something like sticking their grades up on the bulletin board with their social security numbers next to it. That would be a FERPA violation. But these little, I slipped up and I granted a FOIA that I shouldn't have granted will never result in anyone being penalized. And we know that because over half a century, no one ever has been.
I just want to give us a little bit of time to get to some of the questions in the chat, but I appreciate having a larger discussion on FOIA and FERPA, since it's just, it can be really difficult to understand all the legality or just ethics, involved in both issues. But we have a question about a slightly different barrier to communication than what we've already discussed. So if you're an educator and you're invited to speak for a career day, but what if that career day is happening in Florida? We know right now in Florida, the big issue is the Don't Say Gay bill. And whether you are a member of the LGBTQ community or an ally, and what if during that career day talk, students are going to ask you, well, what do you think about this? Or maybe you're an educator in a state where, there's a ban on a book or something like that, and students raise that topic. But, and I welcome any panelists to join in, but what do you do in that situation? Is it best to just decline the career day opportunity? Or if you agree to participate, are there certain things you should keep in mind about what you can and cannot say?
Well, you just posed every teacher's nightmare with all of these new laws, because every teacher is going through. I'm a social studies teacher on leave to be the AFT president. My school is Clara Barton High School in Brooklyn, New York. I went back to and I'm a gay educator. I'm an out gay educator, you know. I went back to my lesson plans from the 1990s to see how much of what I taught would now be in violation under the laws of New Hampshire, Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma, Florida. You're getting my point. These laws are intended to stop people from being open and honest and transparent with kids in a way of embracing diversity and understanding the struggles and sacrifices, as well as the amazing striving that has happened in the country. And so what I would actually say to any of you who may be gay and go into a school in Florida, please go. Please do it. What's the worst that's going to happen? Somebody's going to tell you to leave. We need to actually make sure that kids can answer, can ask honest questions, and that we answer them in as loving and open and embracive way as possible, to create safe and welcoming environments. I think that we will not know. I assume that the governor of Florida will sign the Don't Say Gay bill. He will tell you it doesn't mean what all of us think in its plain language it means. But it is intended, just like those laws against CRT, which doesn't happen to be taught in K through 12 education in the main. He will tell you it doesn't mean what it says, but essentially it is a way of basically trying to erase lived experience in the name of trying to make everyone feel better, even though what all this is doing is really making people who are vulnerable, people who are Black and brown, people who are gay, people who are trans, really vulnerable, and trying to eliminate their lived experience.
I hope that answered your question, but I think that Randi touched on some really important points that, you know, if you are who you are and you go to the classroom, what is the worst that can happen, to really ask yourself that before you consider declining a request. And to pivot to another question. So this one is very common. You're in touch with the public relations officer, or the communications director, and that person says, sure, you can have an interview with the principal or whoever, but can you send your questions in advance? Please send your questions in advance. How do you respond to that? Because that can be a double-edged sword. You know, one, if it's in writing, that makes you vulnerable in some ways. You know, but number two, it also can lock you in, because then the person can claim, well, you said you were going to ask about this, but now you're asking about that, and the interview can be derailed.
So I get that. I get that all.
Yeah.
I get that all the time, and it's one of my pet peeves. And you know, I usually respond, well, I don't usually share my questions in advance, but, you know, to give you an idea, I'm going to be talking, I want to know more about these topics, because I think it's absolutely fair to give someone, say, like, okay, like, I want to know about this subject, this subject, and this subject, because maybe it's complex. They need to go and get data. They need to have the right people, what have you. Like, I don't mind saying, here's the topics, and generally want to know more details about X, Y, Z. That's absolutely fair. But I was like, you know, I don't like to provide questions, because like typically you're going to tell me something that's going to generate more questions. And if I say something that's going to, you know, trigger something with you to like, oh yeah, I should also tell you this. And so it's a conversation. It's not just a one-way street, right? And, you know, I recently had this discussion with a school district that we were having some issues with. And, you know, they were asking how we can build a better relationship and, you know, make life easier for everyone. And I was like, well, one of the things that I think would go a long way to solving a lot of frustration on everyone's part is to have a conversation, because typically you want these, you know, questions in advance. That's just going to be a few of the questions that we're going to have. Like, that's not going to, you know, address everything. We're going to like having a conversation just to talk about like, hey, here's what the story's about. Like, I want to know more about this. that's going to solve so much frustration. And, their response is, well, like, I'm not the subject matter expert. I need to go and talk to that person. And I want to make sure I'm asking them all the right questions. I was like, that goes to giving us direct access to the subject matter expert. Like, I know you don't know everything. I know you didn't get into PR, so you can know all about the science of reading. Like that, you're not going to know that. The subject matter expert is. That's why we need that direct access. So it's all related, but yeah, again, I try to be as polite but persistent as possible.
I'm going to sneak in one more question before we hit 1:30. So throughout the discussion, we've talked a great deal about public students, public school educators. Frank, can you offer some guidance on how these rules may differ for students and educators in private schools? Do things change? I know you elaborated in the chat, but in case anyone didn't see, can you just tell us about your thoughts?
I will. So these are two very different animals. So the question was about both private schools and charter schools. A charter school is recognized under the law as a public school. You receive a charter from the school district and you receive taxpayer money. Therefore, you're bound by all the same constitutional standards, First Amendment, due process, and so on. Private schools, different entirely. Your relationship with them as a student or a parent is like your relationship with Target department store. If you don't like their rules, you can shop at Walmart instead. You can take your business elsewhere, but what you can't do is go to court and sue them for violating your constitutional rights. And by the way, that's true, even though they take a fair amount of government money. It may be interesting in the future as voucher programs get bigger and bigger and these schools get more and more dependent on taxpayer money to see somebody bring that lawsuit. But as it stands right now, it is understood that constitutional rights don't apply inside of private schools. And so therefore, neither the employees nor the students could say, I have a First Amendment right to speak to the press. My advice for talking to kids from any of those types of schools is the same, though, which is that once you step into the building, you've agreed to the rules of the institution, then you're probably bound to, if the institution has said you can't bring your TV camera in here unless you promise not to shoot the faces of the children, then you made a promise, right? And so by all means, if you want faces and names of kids, meet them someplace after hours, and then there won't be that official intermediation. The other thing, just by way of closing out my part of this too, you all have said, and Eva's been really eloquent about how it is important for schools to recognize that cooperating with journalists can be in their best interest and bring forth positive stories. And, that's good, but I would also add to that even if it's a negative story, it is not the job of government agencies to use their authority to make people think more favorably about the government. That is called propaganda. That is not called public relations. And so we threw the tea in the harbor specifically so that we would have the right to criticize the government. And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand civics. And so everyone needs to just get their heads around that we have not only a right, but a duty to criticize the government and to make the government look bad. And if that means that teachers get to vent their displeasure about the policies of the school, then that's really good customer service feedback for the people running those schools, and they should welcome it as public servants.
And all of this really is to help the students. It of course should help the educator and the school as a whole, but the students, the more transparency there is, if the school realizes that they're slipping in some area, this could give them a roadmap for how to improve and therefore deliver a better education. We're at 1:30, but we have had such an excellent discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists, Frank, Eva, Randi. You all have been excellent and really just given me so many things to think about. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
you.
And thank you, Delece,
DWA
for
join.
a great job. Everybody, all of our panelists, I learned a lot myself. I found this program incredibly valuable, and I trust that you all watching did as well. Once again, thank you to our panelists for taking the time today. Thank you to Delece. I hope you stay well. And thank you all again for being here, and we hope to see you again soon.
Bye, everyone.